Book 5 of the Ringing Cedars series, Who Are We by Vladimir Megre. Chapter 1, Two Civilizations. We're always in a hurry to get somewhere or get something. There is hardly a single one of us who doesn't desire to lead a happy life, find love and establish a family. But how many of us will actually achieve our desire? What determines our satisfaction or dissatisfaction with life? What determines our success or failure? What constitutes the meaning of life for each and every man and for all mankind on the whole? What kind of future awaits us? These questions have been around a long time, but nobody has managed to come up with an intelligible answer. But I wonder, what kind of country will we be living in 5 or 10 years from now? What kind of world are we leaving to our children? We really don't know. And let's face it, none of us can ever picture our own future, because we are always hurrying off somewhere. But to where? Strange but true, the first clear glimpse I ever had about the future of our country came not from statisticians or politicians, but from Anastasia, a recluse living in the wilds of the taiga. Not only did she present a picture of a marvellous future, and showed step by step its feasibility, even for our generation, a design, in fact, for the development of the whole country. It was while I was on my way from Anastasia's glade to the river that this firm conviction, for some reason, came to thought. Her plan is capable of changing so much in this world of ours. When we consider that everything her thought conceptualizes inevitably turns into a real-life embodiment, we see we are already living in a country with only a splendid future ahead of it. As I walked along, I thought about what Anastasia had said about our country's splendid future, which might even come about in our generation's lifetime. It will be a country without regional conflicts, criminal gangs and diseases, a country without poverty. And while I didn't understand all the thoughts she came out with, there wasn't a single thing she said this time that I felt like doubting. On the contrary, I felt as though I wanted to show everyone how right she was. I firmly resolved to do everything within my power to bring her plan to fruition. On the surface it seems simple enough. Each family should be allotted a hectare of land for lifetime's use, whereupon to set up its own kin's domain, its own piece of the motherland. But my thought was immersed in the details of this plan. They were utterly simple in themselves, and yet at the same time utterly incredible. Amazing. It isn't an agricultural scientist, but a reclusive woman from the taiga that has shown that. With the right planting arrangement on a plot of land, it can take just a few short years to dispense with the need for fertilization. Not only that, but even soil that isn't terribly fertile will be significantly improved. As a basic example, Anastasia referred to the situation in the taiga. The taiga has been around for thousands of years and everything grows in it, even though it has never been fertilized. Anastasia says that all the things growing in the earth constitute the materialized thoughts of God, and that he has arranged everything so that man has no need to worry about difficulties in finding food. One needs only to try to understand the Creator's thought and create splendid things together with him. I can cite an example of my own. The island of Cyprus, which I have visited, has a very rocky soil, but the ground wasn't always this way. Centuries ago, the island was home to some splendid cedar forests and orchards, and its many rivers were filled with the purest spring water. The whole island was like an earthly paradise. Then the Roman legions invaded the island and began to cut down the cedars to build their ships. Whole groves were felled. Today, the larger part of the island is covered with stunted growth. The grass looks burnt even in the springtime. Summer rains are a rarity, and there is not enough fresh water. The residents have had to import fertile soil by the barge load to be able to grow anything at all. So the upshot is, Not only has man failed to improve what is being created on the island, but this barbarous interference has actually made things worse. In outlining her plan, Anastasia said that it was essential to plant a family tree, and that people should not be buried in a cemetery, but right there on the beautiful terrain they themselves have nurtured. No headstone of any kind need to be placed on the grave. It is a man's living creations, not something dead, that will serve as a memorial for his relations. And not only that, but his soul will be able to take on a material embodiment again in his earthly garden of paradise. People buried in a cemetery cannot end up in paradise. Their souls cannot be embodied in matter as long as there are relatives and friends around thinking about their death. Headstones are monuments to death. Funeral rites were thought up by the dark forces for the purpose of confining, at least temporarily, the human soul. Our Father has never produced any kind of suffering or even grieving for his beloved children. All God's creations are eternal, self-sufficient, self-reproducing. Everything living on the earth, from the outwardly simple blade of grass to man, is a self-constituted, harmonious and eternal whole. Here too, I think she is right. Just look at how things have turned out. Today, scientists tell us that human thought is material. But if that's the case, it means that the deceased person's relatives, in thinking of him as dead, thereby keep on holding him in a deadened state, which torments his soul. Anastasia maintains that man, or more precisely man's soul, can live forever. It has the capacity to constantly re-embody itself anew, but only under certain conditions. These conditions are brought about by a kin's domain, established according to Anastasia's design. I am simply a believer in this design. As to proving or disproving her claims about life and death, I'll leave that to esoteric scholars who are no doubt more qualified for the task. I say, you're going to get a lot of opposition on that one, I observed to Anastasia, to which she only laughed and replied, "It will all happen very simply now, Vladimir. Man's thought is capable of materializing and changing the shape of objects, predetermining events, creating the future. So it works out that any opponents who try to argue for the frailty of man's existence will only end up destroying themselves, for they will bring about their own decease by their very thoughts. Those who are able to comprehend their purpose and the meaning of infinity will start to live a happy life, eternally re-embodying themselves, for they themselves will produce with their thoughts their own infinity of happiness." Woo! I liked her plan. Even better when I began to calculate its economic potential. I have become convinced that any man, with the help of a family domain he establishes according to Anastasia's design, can ensure a poverty-free existence for himself as well as for his children and grandchildren. It is not merely a question of providing one's children with good food or to eat or a roof over their heads. Anastasia said that the fence around the domain must be made of living trees, and that at least a quarter of the hectare should be given over to forest. That means about 300 trees. They'll quite likely be cut down in, say, 80 to 100 years, yielding about 400 cubic meters of lumber. Even today, lumber well dried and processed for finishing fetches at least $100 per cubic meter, meaning a total income of $40,000. Of course, one shouldn't cut down the whole forest at once, just the number of mature trees that are needed at the time, and then immediately plant new ones in their place. The overall value of a kin's domain set up according to Anastasia's design may be estimated at $1 million or more, and any family can build one, even those with an average income. The house can be quite modest to start with. The main treasure will be the plot of land, accurately and aesthetically laid out. Even today, wealthier citizens are paying big money to firms specializing in landscape design. There are about 40 such firms in Moscow right now, and they are always busy. For upwards of 1,500, they will take just the 100 square meters of ground around your house and turn it into a landscape designed with detailed accuracy and aesthetic beauty. It costs around $500 to plant a single conifer, about 6 meters high. But people who want to live in beautifully appointed surroundings are willing to pay big money for that. They end up paying it because it never entered their parents' heads to establish a family domain for their children. You don't need to be rich to do something like that. You need only to get your priorities straight. How can we raise our children properly if we ourselves don't grasp such simple things? Anastasia's right when she says that education begins with ourselves. I myself have had a strong desire to establish my own family domain, to take a hectare of land, build a house, and most importantly, to put in all sorts of plantings around it. I want to set up my piece of the motherland just as Anastasia described, and have it surrounded by other people's beautifully appointed plots. Anastasia and our son could establish themselves there too, or at least come visiting, and eventually our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Maybe our great-grandchildren will want to work in the city, but they will still be able to come to their family domain to relax. And once a year, on the 23rd of July, the all-earth holiday, the whole extended family will gather at home. I shan't be around then myself, but the domain I set up will remain, and the trees and garden it contains. I'll hollow out a little pond and put in some hatchlings so there'll be fish. The trees will be planted in the special arrangement outlined by Anastasia. Some things my descendants will like, others they may want to change, but either way I shall be remembered. And I shall be buried in my own kin and my own domain, with the request that my grave not be marked in any way. I don't want anyone putting on a show of grief or making a sad face over it. In fact, I don't want there to be any grieving at all. I don't want a headstone with an inscription, just fresh grass and bushes growing over my body. Some sort of berries too, which will be useful to my descendants. What's the point in a grave marker? There isn't any, only grief. I don't want people coming to my domain to remember me with sadness, but with joy. Yeah, they'll see how I've set things up and arranged all the plantings. My thoughts kept intertwining in a kind of joyful anticipation of something grand. I'd better begin as quickly as possible and somehow start the ball rolling. I've got to get back to the city quicker, but it'll still be another 10 kilometres just to get through this forest. If only I could get through it sooner. And all at once, out of the blue, statistics on Russia's forest lands floated to the surface of my memory. I didn't remember all the figures, but here's what I saw one time in a statistical report. Forests constitute the basic type of vegetation in Russia, covering 45% of its landmass. Russia has the most extensive forest reserves in the world, amounting to 886.5 million hectares in 1993, with a timber volume of 80.7 billion. This means Russia holds 21.7 and 25.9 respectively of the world's forest and timber resources. The higher figure for timber reflects the fact that in terms of its wealth of mature and productive forests, Russia is way above the world's average. Forests play a huge role both in the gas balance in the atmosphere and in regulating climate on our planet. According to B.N. Moisev's calculations, the gas balance of Russia's forests is 1,789 million tonnes for carbon dioxide and 1,299 million tonnes for oxygen. Annual carbon deposits in Russia's forests amount to 600 million tonnes. These huge volumes of gas exchanges significantly contribute to the stabilisation of the gas composition and climate of the whole planet. Just look at what's happening. I've heard it said some kind of special mission lies ahead for Russia, But that's not in the future, it's already unfolding. Just think, people all over the planet, to a greater or lesser extent, it isn't important, are breathing Russia's air. They're breathing the oxygen produced by this very forest I'm walking through right now. I wonder whether it's simply oxygen that this forest is supplying all life on the planet with, or maybe something even more important besides. My solitary walk through the taiga this time provoked no feeling of trepidation within me as it did before. It felt pretty much the same as walking through a safe park. In contrast to a park, of course, there are no laid out pathways, and my journey was sometimes blocked by fallen trees or thick underbrush, but this time there was nothing that irritated me. Along the way I would pick berries, raspberries and currants, for example, and for the first time my attention was drawn to the tremendous variety in appearance, even among the same kinds of trees. And the vegetation too was arranged in so many different patterns. No two scenes were alike. For the first time I really examined the taiga, and it seemed a kinder place than before. No doubt this impression was due, in part, to the awareness that it was right here in the taiga that my very own son was born, and was now living. And then, of course, there's Anastasia. My encounter with this woman has changed my whole life. In the middle of this endless taiga is Anastasia's little glade, which she has no desire to leave for any length of time. She would never exchange it for any, even the fanciest apartment in town. At first glance, the glade appears to be just another empty space. No house, no tent, no household facilities. And yet look how she brightens with joy every time she approaches it. And now, on my third visit, I've caught a similar feeling. Something like the sense of comfort one feels upon returning home after a difficult journey. Funny things have been taking place lately all over our world. It seems that for millennia now, human society has been struggling for the happiness and welfare of the individual. But when you come right down to it, it turns out that this same individual, even though he lives at the very centre of society, at the centre of the most modern and civilised city, finds himself more and more often in a state of helplessness. He gets into a traffic accident, or gets robbed, or constantly falls into the grip of all sorts of aches and pains. He can't live without a drugstore nearby, or some dissatisfaction he can't even explain to himself provokes him into suicide. The suicide rate is increasing, particularly in civilised countries with a high standard of living. Mothers from various regions of the country are seen on TV pleading for help for their families threatened with starvation because they can't afford to feed their children. Yet here is Anastasia living with a little boy all alone in the taiga, in what can only be called another civilization. Not a single thing does she ask from our society. She needs no police or home security forces to protect her. She gives the impression that nothing bad can possibly happen in this glade to either her or her child. It's true. We live in different civilizations, and she proposes to take the best of both these worlds, in which case the lifestyle of many people on the earth will change, and a new and joyous commonwealth of humanity will be born. This commonwealth will not only be interesting, it will be new and unusual. For example, end of chapter 1. Chapter 2. Take a taste of the universe. For a long time it bothered me that Anastasia appeared so content to leave her nursing child all by himself. She would simply put him down on the grass under some bushes or next to the dozing she-bear or she-wolf. I was already convinced that not a single creature would touch him. On the contrary, they would defend him to the death. But from whom? If all the animals around were acting like nannies, then who would they need to protect him from? Still, it was unusual to leave a nursing baby all alone, and I tried to dissuade Anastasia, saying, just because the animals won't touch him, that doesn't mean that there are no other misfortunes out there that could befall him. To which she responded, "I cannot imagine, Vladimir, what misfortunes you have in mind. There are a lot of things that could happen to helpless children. Let's say he crawls up a hillock, for example, and then tumbles down, twisting his ankle or his wrist. Any height of ground the baby could crawl up on his own would not cause him any harm. But say he eats something harmful, he's still too young, everything goes into his mouth, so it won't be long before he poisons himself. And then who's going to be around to flush out his insides? There aren't any doctors in the neighbourhood, and you don't even have an enema to flush out his intestines in case of emergency." Anastasia just laughed. "What need is there for an enema, Vladimir? The intestines can be flushed out another way, and much more effectively than with an enema. How so? Would you like to try it? It will do you a world of good. I shall simply bring you a few little herbs. Hold on, don't bother, I understand. You want to give me something to make my stomach upset. Your stomach has been upset for a long time, Vladimir. The herb I have in mind will expel anything causing your stomach harm." "I get it. In case anything happens, you can give a herb to a child, and it will make him go to the bathroom. But why take things to such lengths when it comes to a baby? It will not go that far. Our son will eat nothing that is going to harm him. Children, especially those who are nursing and accustomed to the taste of their mother's milk, will never eat anything else in a significant quantity, and our son will only take a little taste of any berry or herb. If he finds it noxious or bitter, a substance that could harm him, he will spit it out himself. If he eats a little of it and it begins to affect his stomach, he will vomit it, and that will help him remember, and he will not try it again. But he will come to know the whole earth, not from someone else's reports, but by tasting it on his own. Let us allow our son to taste the universe for himself." No doubt Anastasia is right. It is true nothing bad has happened to the little one so far, not even once. Besides, I noticed a particularly interesting phenomenon. The creatures around her glade themselves trained their young how to interact with man. I used to think Anastasia was the one that did this, became convinced that that is not something she wastes her time on. This is what I saw on one occasion. We were sitting in the sun at the Anastasia had just finished nursing our son, and he was blissfully lying in her arms. Initially, he seemed to be having a nap or just dozing, but then all at once, his little hand began touching Anastasia's hair, and he broke into a smile. Anastasia looked at her son and smiled back, whispering something in his ear with her tender voice. I saw the she-wolf come out into the glade with her brood, 4 cubs still quite young. The wolf came over to us and stopped about 10 meters away and lay down on the ground. The cubs, trailing along behind her, quickly began nuzzling up to her belly. Upon seeing the wolf and her cubs lying there, Anastasia rose from the ground, babe in arms, and went over to her. She squatted down about 2 meters away and began inspecting the wolf's brood, her face all smiles, and saying, "Oh, what beauties our clever wolf has born! One of them will most certainly be a leader, while this little one is the spitting image of her mamma. She will be a joy to her mamma, and a worthy inheritor to carry on the family line." The mother wolf seemed to be dozing, her languishing eyes closed tight either from drowsiness or from soft caressing of Anastasia's voice. The cubs turned away from the mother's belly and began looking at Anastasia. One of them, still unsure of his step, began making his way over to her. The mother, who just a second before had looked so drowsy, suddenly sprang up, seized the cub with her teeth, and dropped him back among the others. Then the same thing occurred with the second cub, then the third and the fourth, all trying to get closer to Anastasia. The inexperienced cubs continued their attempts, but the mother would not let them go until they had finished their little adventures. 2 of the cubs began tussling with each other. The other 2 sat meekly and kept a watchful eye on us. The baby in Anastasia's arms also noticed the wolf family. He began watching them. and then his legs began kicking impatiently, and he uttered some kind of beckoning sound. Anastasia reached out a hand toward the wolves. Two of the cubs began heading with unsure step in the direction of the outstretched human hand. This time, however, the mother didn't try to stop them. On the contrary, she began nudging the other two cubs who were still at play in the same direction, and before long all four were right at Anastasia's feet. One of them began nibbling on one of her fingers. A second got up on its hind legs and rested its forepaws on her arm, while the other two crawled over her leg. The boy started to squirm in Anastasia's arms, evidently wanting to get closer to the cubs. Whereupon Anastasia let him down on the ground and he started playing with them, oblivious to anything else. Anastasia went over to the mother wolf and after giving her neck a gentle stroking came back to me. I realised that the wolf had been trained never to disturb Anastasia without being invited, and would approach her only upon a predetermined gesture. Now she was teaching this same rule to her offspring. The wolf, no doubt, had been taught this by her own mother, who in turn had learnt it from her mother, and so on from generation to generation. All the creatures transmitted to their young the rules of interaction with man. A reverent and tactful interaction, it must be said. But who taught them that other kind of interaction, and how? To attack man. My exposure to the life of the Siberian taiga recluses raised a whole lot of different questions. Questions I could not have even imagined asking earlier. Anastasia has no intention of changing her reclusive lifestyle. But stop right there. When I think of Anastasia as a recluse, each time I associate the word recluse with someone who has isolated himself from society, from our contemporary information systems. But what is really going on? After each visit to her glade, I end up putting out a new book. A book that is discussed by all sorts of people, young and old, scientists and religious leaders. The way it turns out, it is not I who bring her information from our over-informed society, but it is she who offers me information that proves to be of great interest to our society. So then, who is the real recluse? Haven't we got caught up so much in the abundance, or more correctly, the seeming abundance of information at our fingertips, that we have set ourselves apart, distanced ourselves from the true source of information? It's simply amazing when you think about what's really going on. Anastasia's remote taiga glade serves as a real information centre, like a launch pad propelling us into the other dimensions of our existence. Then, who am I? Who are we? And who is Anastasia? In any case, perhaps it isn't all that important. Something else is much more important, namely her latest sayings concerning the possibility of transforming the life of any individual man for the better, or, for that matter, any country, or even human society as a whole. And this is effected through changing the living conditions of an individual. It's all incredibly simple. Just give a man at least 1 hectare of land, and she goes on to explain what to do with this land, and then, incredible, how simple it is. A man will always be surrounded by the energy of love. Those in marital relationships will love their spouses. Their children will be happy. Many diseases will be eradicated. Wars and catastrophes will cease. Man will draw closer to God. She has, in fact, proposed the construction of a whole lot of glades similar to her own in the proximity of major cities. But this doesn't mean she rejects making use of our civilization's achievements. Let what is negative be pressed into service on behalf of good, she says. And I have come to believe in her plan. I believe in that splendid turn of events that is to come about as a result of implementing her ideas in our lives. And a lot of them seem so logical to me. All we have to do is go over everything, think everything through in the right order. We have to adapt her proposal to each location. I was especially struck by Anastasia's idea regarding land and its development. I could hardly wait to get home and see what scientists have to say about similar communities. Does anything along this line exist anywhere in the world? I wanted to see if I could start by designing a new community in all its detail, and then start building it through the concerted efforts of those desiring to participate in its construction. Naturally, neither I nor anyone else can undertake the responsibility for getting this marvellous community of the future going all on our own. It's something we need to do together. We shall have to examine all the information collectively and design our community, taking into account mistakes other people have made. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Dreams of Oroville. During the first months after returning from my visit with Anastasia, I set about making an intensive search and study of any information about eco-communities I could lay my hands on. Most of my sources told about experiments abroad. Altogether, I collected information on 86 communities in 19 countries: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, England, France, Germany, India, and others. But I wasn't particularly struck by any of the reports I'd collected. No country could boast any kind of large-scale eco-movement, nor did I come across any communities capable of exercising a significant influence on the social situation in their respective countries. One of the largest and best-known communities that came to my notice is located in India. It goes by the name of Oroville. I'd like to elaborate a little on this one. Oroville was initiated in 1968 by the wife of the founder of the integral yoga movement, Sri Aurobindo, Mira Richard. It was thought that the community, once begun, would even eventually grow into a thriving city of 50,000 on lands allocated by the Indian government near Pondicherry, where Sri Aurobindo's ashram, a centre for integral yoga adherents, had been operating since the 1940s. Oroville, or the City of Dawn, was supposed to embody the idea of unity of people united by a common goal of building a harmonious material world, which in no way would find itself at odds with the world of the spirit. The community's charter, written by Mira Richard, states, Oroville will be a site of material and spiritual researches for a living embodiment of an actual human unity. The idea of building a city wherein people will live in harmony with the world of nature, in the harmony of the spirit and love, was approved by the Indian government. Oh, right, okay, that's not somebody speaking. Was approved by the Indian government and personally by Indira Gandhi, as well as UNESCO. It received financial support from the Indian government along with a large number of sponsors. Representatives of 121 nations and 23 Indian states attended the opening ceremonies, after which this splendid city, no doubt the dream of a lot of people the world over who call themselves spiritual, began to take shape. However, following the death of Mira Richard in 1973, one of Aurobindo's disciples by the name of Satprem spoke out strongly against the Oroville community, calling it nothing but a commercial enterprise. Sri Aurobindo's ashram, which controlled most of the enterprise's finance, claimed authority over everything going on in the city, but the residents considered that their community belonged to the whole world and was not under the ashram's jurisdiction. A serious confrontation ensued between the spiritual leaders on both sides, a confrontation which was not confined to the ideological level but became more and more physical. In 1980, the Indian government was obliged to pass a decree removing Oroville from the control of Sri Aurobindo Society, and a permanent police detachment was assigned to the community. The Auroville situation led to a general crisis in Sri Aurobindo's movement and teachings. Today, Auroville has about 1,200 residents instead of the 50,000 or more envisaged by its initiators. The whole region, including the local population, comprises 13 villages and 30,000 people. Quite possibly, the downfall of the Auroville dream was precipitated by the following situation. While any resident may obtain permission to buy land and build himself a house at his own expense, legal title to the land on which the house stands belongs to the city. Thus, it turns out that full confidence is placed in Auroville as a city, but is not accorded any of its individual residents. Every resident lives in a state of dependency on the community as a whole, and yet the whole project was worked out by people who considered themselves highly spiritual. It seems that in the case of spirituality, there is another side of the coin to be considered. I am extremely disturbed and upset by the situation of Auroville today. While it has not provoked any doubts about Anastasia's project, I cannot say my mind is entirely free from negative thoughts. If things did not work out with a model community in India, a country considered practically the leader in the spiritual understanding of human existence, especially with the financial backing of the Indian government, UNESCO, and sponsors from a variety of countries, then how can Anastasia possibly foresee on her own all the pitfalls that lie ahead? Even if it isn't all on her own and the masses of readers sharing her views try to make calculations, think everything through and foresee the future. Even then, there is no guarantee such concerted efforts will succeed, as nobody has any experience along this line. If anyone knew where to find the foundation on which to build a happy life for both the individual and society as a whole, a happy society would have probably been built somewhere, but it doesn't exist anywhere in the world. The only experience we have is negative. Where can we find anything positive? In Russia, replied Anastasia. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Harbingers of a New Civilization. The first shoots of a new and splendid future are to be found in the Russian Dachniks. These words sounded within me, all by themselves. Anastasia was not around at the time. It took but a moment to recall the enthusiasm and joy with which she talked to me about the Russian Dachniks 4 years ago. She believes that it was thanks to the Dachniks that a global catastrophe on the Earth was avoided in 1992. So it turns out that it was in Russia that this amazing movement began, a movement which has had a kindly influence on a part of the Earth. I remember her telling me, millions of pairs of human hands began touching the Earth with love, with their hands, you understand, not a bunch of mechanical contraptions. Russians touched the ground caressingly on these little dacha plots, and the earth felt the touch of each individual hand. The earth may be big, but it is very, very sensitive, and the earth found the strength within itself to carry on. Back then, 4 years ago, I didn't take this saying seriously, but now, after learning of all the various attempts by people of different countries of the world to create spiritual ecological communities, I suddenly realised something. With no noisy fanfare, appeals, advertising, or pompous ceremonies, the most massive scale project has come to fruition right here in Russia. A project having significance for all humanity. When seen against the backdrop of all the various Russian dacha communities, all the reports from various countries on the creation of eco-communities there sound quite ludicrous. Judge for yourselves. Here, spread out in front of me, is a pile of articles and collections of reports seriously discussing the question of how many people should live in an eco-community. A population of no more than 150 is advised. Considerable attention is paid to the governing bodies of such communities and their spiritual leadership. But Russia's dacha cooperatives have existed for years, sometimes comprising 300 families or more. Each cooperative is managed by 1 or 2 people. usually somebody retired from their regular job. If in fact you can call the chairman of a Russian dacha cooperative a manager, he's actually more like a registrar or a manager who simply carries out the will of the majority. Russia does not have any centralised management system for its dacha movement. However, according to data published by the State Statistics Committee in 1997, 14.7 million families had fruit growing plots, while 7.6 million had vegetable plots. The overall land area cultivated by these families amounted to 1,821,000 hectares. These households independently grew 90% of Russia's potatoes, 77% of its berries and fruit, and 73% of its vegetables. No doubt the theoreticians who have been designing eco-communities and eco-villages for years will protest that a dacha cooperative is not the same as an eco-community, to which I wish to immediately respond. It is not the name but the content that is important. The overwhelming majority of Russia's dacha cooperatives conform to eco-community guidelines. Not only that, but with no thunderous declarations on spiritual self-improvement and the necessity of a careful approach to nature, the Dachniks have proved their spiritual growth not by words, but by their way of life. They have planted millions of trees. It is thanks to their labours on hundreds of thousands of hectares thought to be infertile and good for nothing, so-called marginal lands, that orchards are now flourishing. We keep hearing how in Russia part of the population is on the verge of starvation. We see strikes by teachers, then by miners, and our politicians are scratching their heads in their attempts to bring the country out of crisis after crisis. More than once during the perestroika period, Russia was but a hair's breadth away from a massive social upheaval, but it didn't happen. And now let's try mentally deducting from just the past few years of our lives the 90% of potatoes, 77% of berries, and 73% of vegetable production, and substitute a heightened anxiety level on the part of millions of people. This you would have to do if you were going to exclude from the past few years the calming effects of the dashers. You don't have to be a psychologist to see how Dachniks are calmed by their contact with the vegetable plots they have planted. So if we take away that factor, what would we have been left with in 1992, 1994 or 1997? In any of those years, a colossal social upheaval could have come about. What kind of result might such an upheaval have led to on a planet chock full of deadly weapons? But no catastrophe occurred. Anastasia maintains that in 1992 a catastrophe on a global scale was avoided thanks to the Russian Dachniks. And now, having read all the reports explaining the situation, I tend to agree with her. It's not so important anymore to know just which smart head in our nation's government came up with the idea of giving the green light to the Dacha movement in Russia, still the Soviet Union back then. Or maybe it was Providence itself that saw fit to accord this privilege specifically to Russia. What's important now is that the movement exists, and it is proof positive that there is indeed a possibility of achieving stability in human society. Maybe even that stability so many peoples on various continents have been trying without success to achieve for thousands of years. Anastasia says that the dacha movement in Russia represents a momentous turning point in the development of human commonwealth. Dachniks are the harbingers of a splendid future which will come after them. She has said, thinking of the future communities she has sketched out, and I myself would very much like to live in one of these splendid communities, a community located in a flourishing country, whose name just happens to be Russia. End of chapter 4.